Looking at shepherding today. Now, as we think about shepherding, one of the reasons why are we even going through Bible backgrounds and cultures, right? Why are we doing this? Well, so that as we look at the Bible and as we read it, it's going to help give a little bit more life and understanding to when we read about different aspects of the Bible, we're understanding a little bit better. Now, when it comes to shepherding, there are animal husbandry and shepherding is one of the oldest forms of living that we have recorded for us. If it didn't matter if you stayed in one place or if you traveled, you quite often had livestock because you used the livestock, whether it was sheep or cattle or goats, to give you a lot of the needs, meet a lot of your needs, whether it was milk, whether it was skin for building materials such as tents, or fur or wool, not fur, but wool or hair for clothing. And there was lots of different options that were given by owning livestock and cattle. And that was one of the primary ways that you knew how wealthy someone was, is depending on how they were doing with their flocks and their herds. Did they have the manpower to take care of those flocks and herds? And did they have access to good water and good feeding places for their herds to eat? And so I'm going to pop quiz. What's the first mention of shepherding in the Bible? Abel. Oh, we are on top of it this morning. Good. And that's in Genesis chapter 4. And we see the description of Abel as a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Now, something that we do need to remember is that this is not, well, Abel chose a good life skill and a good practice, and Abel, well, because he was a farmer or a gardener, then he was a problem. And that's not the case. What was the problem was their hearts and how they approached God and their understanding of how that worked. All right, so that was Abel. Now, who else do we have? He's really famous. He's kind of a patriarch, or there are several patriarchs who kept sheep. Abraham, right? We're told in Genesis chapter 13, Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev, and he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now, Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. So Abraham had other wealth besides the livestock, but he was a wealthy man. And what else do we know about Abraham? Abraham had a son. His name was Isaac. Did Isaac keep lots of sheep and livestock? And the answer is yes. And Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob, we know, tricked his brother. He had to leave home. There was a bit of a falling out with his older brother. And he went and met unfortunately, one of his future wives. And who was she? Rachel. And what was she? She was a shepherdess. We're told that in Genesis 29, verses 9 and 10. Now, I just have some really nice slideshows of sheep in the Middle East. Do you see something? Well, you know what? Let's just take a look. The sheep that they use the most, would you like a sheep with that? It's just, there are actually several breeds of what are called fat-tailed sheep. They're one of the oldest They're one of the oldest types of sheep in. You'd think that was a tumor. Does that sheep have cancer? Is it fit in FTD, fixing to die? No, it's okay. This is what it's supposed to be. This is what it's supposed to be. And what that is that's kind of like a camel sheep, basically, except the hump on the back, it's on the back end. And so there's several breeds. And here's another one. You can see, and so as they're able to eat and they're in good grazing places, they actually store nutrients in their tail. And we actually have reference to this back in the Bible. So the fat tail provides a reserve of strength for the sheep. All right, there is energy in the tail. When the sheep is butchered, this fatty tail is quite valuable. People will buy the tail or part of it and use it for frying. This is a variety of sheep that was used in ancient times, as seen by references in the Pentateuch to the fat tail of the sheep. So when the Israelites are coming out of Egypt and they're getting set up with the sacrificial system and stuff like that, it talks about taking the fat of the tail and the entrails, and that's how you're like, fat and a tail. I mean, I don't see many fat tails around here. Now we have, and I was amazed. Like, some of these sheep are, that's pretty impressive for a fat tail. That is very impressive. And that's not uncommon. If they're in good feeding pasture and stuff like that, their tails get pretty big. All right? So as we work through, some other things are going to come into play. As we think about a shepherd himself and shepherding sheep, what do they wear? Well, very similar to what any Middle Eastern man or woman would have worn at the time, depending on if it was a man or a shepherd or a shepherdess. But they would have their tunic, but they would also have a mantle. Now, some of the reading that I did, depending on who you are or where you are, some of them actually did use camel hair or as their mantle. I guess camel hair has some pretty good insulating qualities, but also it could have been wool kept for warmth. And this was when it got cool and damp and you had to stay, you were sleeping out under the stars, you wanted something warm and dry. Maybe it would get wet, but you would stay warm and dry. One of the things, I had a nice wool hat for hunting, and it would get wet, but it would still keep me warm even though it was wet. One of the things that I learned in EMS for wilderness EMT class is that cotton kills. Whether it's hot or cold, cotton is just not a really good, we like it for the heat, but when you get it wet, it doesn't insulate. You get cotton wet and you are out in the woods and you get hypothermia really quick. So having something like wool or camel hair to keep you warm is important. The other thing that you would have is, we're going to get to that in a moment, but you would have a rod and a staff. And the shepherd's rod was often kind of like a billy club. Basically, it was a club. Sometimes there would be some nails or spikes of some sort attached to the end. It would be stout and heavy, and that was used primarily for a defensive weapon. It was not used on the sheep. The other one would be the staff. And the staff, depending on what it was, it could be straight or crooked. It could have a hook on the end, like we typically think of like a shepherd's staff, or some of them were straight, and it was basically used to guide and to corral the animals. It wasn't used to whack them necessarily, but it was used to guide the animals. And so there was a difference between the rod, which was used for protection, and the staff, which is, it could be 5 to 6 feet long, possibly have a hook or a crook on the end, and used for handling the sheep. The other thing that they would have, we're going to get there in a moment, there's a nice other example of a shepherd's crook. The other thing they would have, is a scrip, or a shepherd's bag. And this could be a small leather pouch made from animal skin, or depending, they might actually take a whole animal skin and turn it inside out, sew it up, and the legs would be used as your harness or your shoulder strap. Can you imagine? It looks like you're carrying an inside-out animal on your shoulder. And the neck, where the neck would actually be how you would access the things that you need. And think about a shepherd, he's out leading his sheep. He might be away from home for a few days, so what sort of things would he have in his bag? Well, maybe some food. He might have a water skin besides, depending on where he is. And then, in addition, he might have some personal belongings, or he might have his sling. And slings were made in different ways. This one looks like it's actually made out of fibers from plant fibers, but they could be made from sinew as well, plant or sinew fibers. They'd be woven together. And I was intimidated. I didn't try to do it. There's a way that you can put embedded video into a slideshow, but if you move the slideshow around in your files too much, you lose the embedded video. So I didn't do that. But basically, it's not something, quite often we hear like, well, the song, one little stone went into the sling and the sling went round and round and round and round and round and round and round. It doesn't go round and round and round and round. It can, but quite often you'd put the stone in, you'd go like one or two more and then release. It's not something that you sit there and just swing constantly. And so they'd have their sling and some stones in their bag as well. The other thing that they would have, they would sometimes have a harp or some sort of musical instrument that they could use to calm the sheeps down because sheep are, who's ever been to the fair and noticed sheep? Sheep are, for some reason, goats, they'll come right up to you, talk to you. They'll say hi. They want your attention. Sheep are a little more timid when there's lots of noise. They're kind of not as forward as goats. Loud noises can scare them. They are extremely, domesticated sheep are very prone to predation by wild animals around them. And so being able to protect them and keep them calm, because sheep also, for some reason, they like, if the leader goes, the rest of the flock will follow them. And even if it's somewhere where they shouldn't be and dangerous, sheep just are not necessarily known for their grand intelligence. It's just the way it is. But as we think through shepherding, let's think about Psalm 23, and we're going to go there now. Because who wrote Psalm 23? David. David wrote Psalm 23, later to be king of Israel. And what is interesting, as we see David, he's in Psalm 23, he is seeing the Lord's care, and he's kind of correlating that to the care of a shepherd for his sheep. And shepherds, they knew that their sheep needed water. They knew they needed food. And some things to keep in mind is sheep do, I did some looking, just in a farming type thing, sheep prefer non-moving water. Sheep are timid going near water. They are not very good swimmers. And during most of the year, what are they wearing? A whole bunch of wool. And if they fall in water, what happens to wool? It just absorbs a lot of water, and they can get swept away and drown if it's moving water. So a wise shepherd would bring their sheep to places where the water was still, where it wasn't making them nervous and jumpy, because jumpy sheep around water isn't a good idea either, and let them drink. The other thing that we're going to see is that shepherds also knew that sheep are not super intelligent with their feeding. Sheep, if you leave them in a place long enough, guess what? They will go all the way down to the roots. They will eat the roots right out of the ground, and there'll be this big brown spot. So in order to keep the sheep fed and be able to have them continue to have food, you had to move your flock and make sure you brought them to different pastures at different times so that they would be able to continue to have food and eat. It was interesting. This isn't Middle East now. I was looking at different things as far as shepherding and sheep. And actually in Europe, one of the things that they did in Germany is you would have landowners, and you're always like, how do they cut their grass? Well, they would actually hire out a shepherd to come and eat down a certain plot of their field. And so the shepherd would have to take all the sheep, and with the use of a sheepdog, so the shepherd would lead the sheep would follow after the shepherd, and the sheepdog would basically, the German shepherd in this case, would actually just play perimeter with the sheep to just keep them from going in other people's fields that they weren't supposed to be eating in at the time. So, and that's how they kept their lawn short. But the shepherd also knew he couldn't let the sheep stay there too long. Otherwise, might have to pay the person back because he just ate all his grass. So that's completely not Middle Eastern, but I thought you'd find that interesting as far as that's how they kept their lawn short, as they'd hire out sheep. And sheep are good at eating it close. My mom talked about growing up when they had a sheep and a goat, the sheep would eat anything. You know, the joke about the goat eating tin cans and stuff. That wasn't the case. The sheep would eat anything, and they got them to kind of keep the grass short in the lawn. The sheep would eat the grass. The goat wanted the leaves out of the tree. The goat was super picky. So, but anyway, that's a shepherd knowing what he had for sheep and for flocks. It was important for him for the care of his sheep. So let's look at Psalm 23 now. As we kind of keep the ideas of the rod and the staff, the protective and keeping the sheep protected, we have the idea of still waters, and we see that in Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, or I will not be in need. Sheep do not have to worry about where their next meal is coming from. That's the shepherd's responsibility. They take care of them. I shall not want or be in need. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. So shepherds also would be attuned and aware of what was going on with their sheep. If it was hot, they knew that the sheep needed a rest. They're wearing a lot of wool. They don't sweat. They just get hot. All right, he makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters, or still waters. He restoreth my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. For though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, a sheep, I was looking up I was trying to figure out what to put in and what to keep in the slideshow, and you'll find that there are pictures of shepherds in the Middle East even today, and the sheep just love being near their shepherd. They follow him around. The shepherd takes care of them. And one of the things that we see is that the shepherd is the source of protection and care for his sheep. And the sheep know that, and they recognize that, and they want to be near the shepherd. All right, so Psalm 23, starting in verse 5. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So here we have David referring to the Lord as his shepherd, caring for him, providing for his needs. And exactly when he wrote this, we don't know. Was this one that he had written while he's out in the field, while he's shepherding sheep? Is this one that came later? Was this after he had been anointed by Samuel and he knew that he was going to be king, and he knew that he had enemies, namely King Saul, who was jealous and envious of David? Whatever the case may be, we see that David is recognizing that the Lord is the one that he needs to go for protection and safety. What do we know about David? When he went before King Saul, and King Saul about defeating or fighting Goliath, and King Saul says, you can't do that. What was David's track record? What had he already said he'd done? He killed 2 animals. Do we remember what they were? A lion and a bear, right? And I know we're like lion and a bear. There were lions during that time in Israel. As you do some research, you find that lions actually were kind of all, not just in Africa, but up through the Middle East and even to the east of Israel and kind of out through. And then bears, there are still bears in Europe and northern, like up in Turkey and that sort of area. And at one point, there were far more bears down around and even down into the Middle East. Now, one of the main reasons why there aren't those anymore is, well, if you have a bunch of shepherds who are and people whose livelihood is sheep, and you know every time they come and try to take your sheep, you're losing your livelihood, what are you going to do if a bear or a lion shows up? You want to get rid of it. And so you get rid of it. The other aspect of a very likely case of why there isn't much for that around there is the Roman Empire with the Colosseum and the gladiatorial games and the collecting of thousands upon thousands of animals to be used over the years in the Colosseum. Excuse me. So another aspect, as you think about a shepherd and sheep, if they were able, they were out in the countryside caring for their sheep. One of the things that they would try to do is have the opportunity for the sheep to have be protected at night in a fold. And there was several different ways they could do this. That would be either lots of stone, like what you see here, stones stacked in either a square or a circle, or it could be mounded up briars and brambles. And even on top of the stone, they could put briars and brambles as well. There's one from the Middle East. You can see the Bedouin tents there, actually. And that looks a lot more like briars and brambles and just sticks and stuff like that all stacked up. And you would have the sheep would be kept in there. There's another one. There's actually sheep in that one. This is in the Middle East. And there's another sheepfold there. Now you can see there's a wooden gate there. Now that wasn't always the case, that they would have a wooden gate here. The sheep would quite often be going out and about on the countryside during the day, so it wasn't necessarily just a holding area during the day. You wanted your sheep to be able to eat. And during the night, the shepherd would often lay down in the doorway. And this brings us to another analogy. So you would have, let's go to John chapter 10. So as we, excuse me, as we think about a shepherd with sheep and the care for the sheep, the shepherd would actually, the sheep would be brought into the fold for the night. It'd be a protective place. It was to try to keep the predators or robbers out and keep the sheep in. And the shepherd would be the only thing that would keep the sheep in, or the predators or the robbers out. And we actually have, as we think through the shepherd and the care of a sheep and the protection of a sheep, Jesus uses this analogy regarding himself in John chapter 10. Excuse me. And I'm going to start right in verse 1. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. Now, there was an aspect where, say you'd have several different flocks coming, and there would be actually multiple sheepfolds kind of all together, or multiple flocks of sheep all together, and there would be a holding area and there would be a doorkeeper. This would be kind of more of a consolidated place where flocks would come together. And at that point, sometimes the sheep would be marked, so you know whose sheep were whose, but how did you get the sheep out of that fold of out of that fold of sheep, with only taking yours. And the sheep, now this is a big difference compared to a lot of other shepherding or sheep herding operations. This wasn't necessarily free-range sheep. The shepherd would be the one that the sheep knew because he had helped them give birth. He was there when they were born. He would help them if they had gotten injured, because the other thing that would happen is you'd have a sheep if they got hurt. The shepherd knew that the sheep needed to be cared for, and if a sheep got hurt, that was potentially your livelihood that was going to die. So you had to be able to bind wounds, maybe have some sort of poultice or something like that to put on the wounds to care for the sheep. Keeping track of making sure they don't have any sort of disease or mites or something like that. You need to make sure their hooves were healthy. And that required the shepherd to have an intimate knowledge of each one of his sheep, what was going on with it. And if the shepherd is getting to know his sheep and interacting with the sheep are also going to know who? The shepherd. And what we actually see is in this part, the thief and robber climb in, but he who enters by the door is the shepherd. So the shepherd would come to this holding area. There'd be several flocks of sheep within this fold, and the shepherd would just call his sheep, and his sheep would hear the shepherd's voice and would follow the shepherd out of all the mass of sheep milling around in the sheepfold. Now, this is obviously a very underpopulated sheepfold. It's like, I don't see those lots of sheep. But that's the sort of thing that would happen. And this is what Jesus is going to be using as an analogy. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him, the doorkeeper opens. He has legitimate reason to be there. And the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. All right? When he puts forth all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. So the shepherd collects his sheep, he makes sure he has them all, and then he goes forward, and the sheep follow him. A stranger they simply will not follow. So not just someone else can walk up and steal the shepherd's sheep simply by calling them. And the sheep actually would get scared and run away from a stranger, but will flee from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. The figure of speech, Jesus spoke to them, but they did not understand what those things were which he had been saying to them. So Jesus said to them again, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep." All right? So Jesus, there's the large holding area sheepfold where there's multiple shepherds, multiple flocks. And Jesus is referring to the shepherd now. He's going out leading his flock. And now they're in a different fold. And Jesus says, "I am the door of the sheep. All who come before me are thieves, or who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture." So the protection of a shepherd comes from the shepherd, and it is extended to the shepherd's sheep. And Jesus is describing himself as the door, the protection in which sheep enter the fold. But then also we see that the shepherd, Jesus, they will go in and out and find pasture. So there's provision that's also going to come from being a sheep under the care of a shepherd. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Shepherds, when they cared for their sheep, think about David for a moment. Was there a possibility that he could have been killed by either that lion or that bear that came for his sheep? And the answer is yes. but he did it anyway. Do you think it was strictly just he was doing it out of duty? Or was it just, I'm just doing my duty, it's just my job. It's just my job, it's my career, I shepherd. There had to be something else, right? Do you think there was a care and a love for the sheep? These are your responsibility, David. These are your sheep. And he was willing to protect them from both a lion and a bear. Now we have Jesus. He's saying that the shepherd lays down his life for the sheep out of love for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. So a hireling, someone, hey, can you watch the sheep? I've got to go do something. I got to go do something for a couple of days. Can you watch the sheep? The hireling, it's like, well, it's my life or theirs. Well, it's going to be theirs because these aren't my sheep. He flees because he is a hired hand and not concerned about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me, even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, so that I may take it again. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father. Now, what's Jesus referring to? Jesus came as a human, right? As a man, out of love for a sheep. Now, who is Jesus talking to right now in this passage? He's talking to Jews, right? He talked about sheep of another fold that he needs to bring in. Any guesses as to who those might be? It's Gentiles. We're here this morning worshiping God, learning about God, reading the Bible, because Jesus, the Good Shepherd, not only cared for the sheep of Israel, but for sheep of another fold that he would bring in, and that's those who have placed their faith in him. Now Jesus also, this is John chapter 10, not too much longer from now. In John, we have recorded for us the betrayal and arrest of Jesus in his death on the cross. And Jesus died, he gave his life for the sheep. Now, we know that Jesus didn't stay dead, did he? He rose again. And those who have placed their faith in him as their Savior are now under the care and protection of the shepherd. That's an encouraging and wonderful thought to think about. The care that a shepherd has. A shepherd has to know what his sheep needs, right? He has to be in tune and aware of what's going on with each one of his sheep. Because if one of them gets sick, what might happen? You might have several sick sheep. You want to be aware of what's going on and what they need. Be attentive to dangers that might be lurking or present and causing harm. Pastor Brown and I are under shepherds. That's one of our jobs, is to care for and to protect and to look for the best of how we can care for and help and encourage and teach and instruct. But we're only under shepherds. The good shepherd, the chief shepherd, is Jesus Christ. And that's something that Pastor Brown and I both try to keep in mind as we care for all of you, is that there's someone else that we're being held accountable to. There's someone else that is holding us accountable, and how we treat and interact with and care for the sheep that he has given us responsibility over. But also there's encouragement as we look at the life of shepherding. We had already read Psalm 23 and David's interaction with the Lord is my shepherd, Yahweh is my shepherd. For those who have placed their faith in Jesus Christ as their Savior, Jesus is their shepherd. Jesus calls to them, they hear his voice, and they follow. When we got saved, Jesus called to us, we heard his voice, and we followed. We place our faith in him. When we are now under his care, think about Psalm 23 again. And this can be sometimes, right now, I can tell you, we have been looking for vehicles. We thought we had found one. It was perfect. It was a Florida vehicle, no rust. I looked underneath it. It was immaculate. And we were told, no problems, no issues. Like, perfect. So we drove the hour and 15 minutes to get there, turned it on, the engine light was on. Oh, and some nice white smoke came out the back, which probably means a head gasket. And the engine light, the lady's like, my boyfriend has a code reader. And he said it's nothing. So I'm like, okay. So I went and got my code reader, plugged it in. She said, oh, you have a code reader? Yeah, I do, actually. And read it, and it's either the catalytic converter or the oxygen sensor. Okay, but at the same time, there could be something else going on. And at that point, that's just a hassle and a lot of work, and they weren't being upfront and hadn't been driven in almost a year. So it's like you say, there's no problems with it. We get there. Lord, don't you see this? We are trying to find a car. We have looked at so many cars right now. We've gone and looked at so many cars right now. Don't you know what we need? We need a car, God, right? That's what we need. And, well, yes, but does God also know when we need it and how he's going to provide for it and exactly when? And let's just say that God had to deal with some agitated sheep. And preparing for today has been helpful. He leads us by still waters. He knows what we need. He knows that we are flighty. He knows that we are easily scared or distracted. He knows that the thing that we need to drink is the thing that can drag us in and kill us if we're not careful, getting swept away by water. He knows our frailty and our frame. He knows where we need to go for provision. He knows what dangers lie around us better than we do ourselves. And I worked in EMS. Nate's worked in police. Carl's worked in police. They know that there's lots of messed up stuff out there. And depending on where you are, there's even more messed up stuff. And you go, there's people like this in our community? Wow, I thought we were in a pretty safe place. But that's just people. Ephesians 6 says we war not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and the rulers of this dark age. We don't even see that. In God, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. We're on death's doorstep. Danger all around. Your rod and your staff comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. How many of us would be comfortable if we knew that there was people just standing right there that wanted to kill us? And someone else, yeah, just eat. You're fine. I got you. I don't know about that. But yet, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Protection and care. Anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Surely goodness. Surely. In other words, it's a sure thing. It will happen. God knows what we need. He cares for us far better than any of the best shepherds in the Middle East who care for their sheep. And it's interesting, you start looking and people really do care about their sheep. And even despite all of that, we have a God who is a God in heaven, who is our shepherd and cares for us. He meets our actual needs, and then some. And he protects and cares for us in the way that we need. And so as we read through, you're going to find there's different aspects, different accusations you'll see it in the prophets, of God condemning shepherds who have misled his people Israel. And that's the leaders, whether they're religious or the kings. And that they will answer to him. God, as we have looked at Bible backgrounds and customs of a shepherd, kind of his equipment, his care for the sheep, the way that he will interact with the sheep, as we read the Bible, it helps give some color and vividness to the illustrations and the different passages as we read them. So that's why we're doing this, and I hope that this will help as you're reading. Why don't we go ahead and close in prayer? We have a little bit of extra time. Carl.
Wasn't shepherding seen then as a low-level socially outcast?
So that depends on when. So think about when Joseph had his brothers go get Jacob. They come into Egypt, and he said, tell them that you're shepherds and you want Goshen, because the Egyptians looked down on shepherding. So some of it depended on the culture. So the Egyptians had more of what we would consider a civilized, they were not a nomadic lifestyle. They built houses, they built cities, that sort of thing. So they looked down on shepherds. When you come to the time of Christ, shepherds were not necessarily looked down on, although you might be more likely to have, you own sheep, but you kind of sent them with a shepherd to be cared for out in the hills. And then as you kind of get it, and depending on where you are in like the exile and different things like that, one of the things that the religious leaders did is start looking down on, like the Talmud and the Mishnah, looking down at shepherding and at looking as a dirty and awful thing, and we're above such things. But it was not always looked down on, and it kind of depended from time to time period to time period, and also from culture to culture, depending on what it was. I didn't add, and was David the youngest? Quite often the youngest would be the one that would be, the youngest who could stand and walk and protect the sheep would have the job of watching the sheep. So Rachel and Leah, Rachel was the younger, she was the shepherdess. David was the youngest, he was the shepherd. And Jacob and Esau, we have Jacob, he was the one who stayed home and saw over. And sometimes they kind of give this idea, this is kind of getting off on the side, but Jacob and Esau, we kind of think of Esau as like the macho man, and Jacob is kind of like this effeminate, like homebody who just was a mama's boy. And that wasn't necessarily the case. Jacob, when it says he stayed home, it had the idea of he was overseeing and managing the house and the household servants and the shepherd and the flocks and stuff like that. And Esau was just gallivanting out in the woods, basically, or out in the fields, not taking responsibility for his family's responsibilities and stuff like that. So that's just kind of on another note. So any other questions? All right, why don't we go ahead and pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. We thank you that we have a good shepherd, Jesus Christ, who cares for us. We thank you for the time that we've had to look at your word, and we pray that you would use it to encourage us and to help us to rest in you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.